Charles and Harper tied the knot not too long ago. Despite their romance spanning several years, both in their early 30s were independent and well-established, which was certainly commendable. They entered the bond of matrimony with great care, not recklessly plunging into it. They only began cohabitating after making it official with their marital paperwork. Fortunately, Harper had inherited an apartment from her grandmother, proving to be a stroke of luck for the young couple. Each partner maintained individual interests and pursuits, proudly claiming their modern outlook, which allowed them to follow their personal paths rather than simply shadowing one another. Their cherished routine involved sharing dinner, catching up on their favorite TV series, and winding down with tea by candlelight in the kitchen. That particular evening, they settled down after their workday, brewing a second pot of tea. "Can you believe it? Samantha is getting divorced," Harper remarked, her gaze fixed on her phone. Charles was taken aback. Samantha and her husband had always appeared to be the perfect pair. "What happened?" he inquired. "It seems Thomas has rekindled an old flame. Apparently, he's been up to no good behind Samantha's back for the past 6 months." Harper shared nonchalantly, as though infidelity were the norm and unworthy of fuss. Charles eyed his wife warily. "Would you forgive me if I cheated?" he challenged. Without looking up from her phone, Harper countered, "Are you planning to cheat?" "No," he retorted decisively, "and I wouldn't forgive you either." "Well, that's unfortunate," Harper responded dryly. Charles chose not to pursue the conversation further. The tone had set him on edge. He simply shrugged and exited the kitchen. Oddly, this trivial exchange haunted him, replaying over and over in his mind. The thought of infidelity, whether his or hers, had never crossed his mind before. While he was certain of his own fidelity, he couldn't decipher Harper's thoughts on the matter, and this uncertainty troubled him deeply. Charles decided to confide in his friend about his inner struggles, but instead of receiving understanding, his friend only mocked him. Initially, Charles felt offended by his friend's lack of support during that difficult moment. However, over time, he began to agree with his friend's perspective. Perhaps he was creating problems out of thin air. After all, Harper's infidelity was never even a consideration. She had merely shared a story from her friend's life, and Charles had extrapolated everything else from it. Still, he started to notice that his wife had developed a sudden fondness for driving their car. Initially, she brushed it off, claiming that she didn't want her driver's license to collect dust on the shelf. But soon enough, driving became a newfound passion for her. Although Charles secretly chuckled about it behind her back, he never said anything to Harper directly. "Hey, who's always riding with you?" he once asked in an irritated tone while they were together in the car. "Can't you clean up after yourself?" he added, gesturing at the trash in the vehicle. "It's Sua. She's going through a tough time, and I don't want to scold her for leaving some trash behind," Harper replied, trying to smooth things over. "Well then, throw it away yourself. You're the one using the car, so take care of it," she said gently, stroking her husband's shoulder in an attempt to calm him down. Charles couldn't help but smile inwardly at the gesture. He loved his wife and couldn't stay angry with her for long. "Forget it. I'll just throw away these coffee cups and sugar wrappers myself," he thought to himself. One day when Charles returned home from work, he discovered they had a guest, Samantha, the same woman in the midst of a divorce. Surprisingly, she didn't appear sad or even slightly distressed. Genuine happiness filled Charles's heart for her. It meant things weren't as dire as he had imagined. Samantha greeted him warmly with an embrace and a friendly slap on the back. They exchanged a few obligatory pleasantries before Charles went to heat up his dinner. Harper was out on the balcony enjoying a cigarette, so he didn't disturb her. Samantha's eyes flickered with approval as she poured herself a cup of coffee and took a satisfying sip. "Why don't you add some sugar?" "It must be bitter, right? Allow me to fetch it for you," Charles offered, reaching for the sugar bowl. "Ugh," the woman grimaced. "Coffee with sugar is just awful." Charles turned around, his gaze fixing on Samantha in surprise. Wasn't she the one who had left a pile of open sugar packets in the car? Harper had mentioned it. The man decided to approach the topic cautiously and casually asked a question. "Do you see Harper often?" Samantha shook her head, explaining that she barely had time to see anyone. She was overwhelmed with work, the quarterly report looming. and constantly on the phone with Harper. Charles nodded absent-mindedly and resumed his meal. Thoughts swirled in his mind. Whose were the wrappers and empty coffee cups in the car? Why did his wife claim they belonged to her friend? He had no reason to doubt Samantha's honesty. It was a simple matter with no need for lies. All evening his mind was consumed by these thoughts, and even throughout the night he tossed and turned, unable to quiet his suspicions. Finally, a decision emerged. Charles resolved to purchase a covert listening device and discreetly plant it in the car. Immediately, he logged onto the internet to select the perfect device. With that step completed, he went to bed somewhat at ease, feeling a small sense of control over the situation. The awaited day arrived. Charles held the device in his hands, carefully reading the manual. He familiarized himself with its features, configured the conversation recording function, and discreetly placed the beacon beneath the car seat. Now, all that remained was to wait for Harper's next trip in the car, hopefully with an unfamiliar man. He didn't have to wait long. A couple of days later, Harper informed him that she would be using the car to attend divorce hearings with Samantha. Charles smirked, attempting to conceal his satisfaction. He knew with near certainty that no wife in her right mind would take Samantha along as her companion. Charles spent the entire day on pins and needles, eagerly anticipating the moment he could access the car, retrieve the tracker, and listen to the recorded content. Upon returning from work, Harper was already home. Charles delivered a well-rehearsed speech about needing to meet a friend and hastily left the house. His heart raced as he approached the car. What would he discover? Would this moment change everything? Would it bifurcate his entire existence? For now, only speculation loomed. He inserted his earphones into the recording device and pressed the play button. His palms were damp, and Charles trembled slightly from the cold as he waited to hear the truth. He had to rewind the recording multiple times until he finally heard the sound of a door slamming and a man's voice. Charles's heart sank to the pit of his stomach. Could it be that all of his worst fears were coming true at this very moment? Harper and the stranger engaged in conversation, but Charles's mind was cloudy, and he could barely comprehend their words. He fast-forwarded a bit further. The noise of the car's engine was no longer audible on the recording, but the distinct sounds of creaking and groaning filled the air. Then his wife's moans. Abruptly, Charles yanked the earphones out of his ears. He couldn't catch his breath, as though he had just sprinted 100 meters. Suddenly, he realized he was sitting with his hands, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. A crazed expression etched across his face. It was not a pleasant sight. He couldn't delay any longer. Charles came to the decision that he needed to act swiftly, like ripping off a Band-Aid. With the recording device held tightly in his hands, he returned to the apartment. Harper appeared surprised by his sudden return. Without a word, Charles handed her the earphones and pressed play. Her reaction was immediate. The recording left no room for explanation or denial. Her face paled as the truth unraveled in real time. Harper didn't attempt to justify her actions, nor did she beg for forgiveness. She simply stood there, silent. The apartment they once shared, interestingly enough, belonged to Harper. Charles had no choice but to leave hastily, taking next to nothing with him. Temporarily, he moved in with a friend before eventually securing a modest rental room through acquaintances. Through mutual connections, Charles inevitably learned bits and pieces about his former wife life. Harper had sold the apartment and relocated to another area, reportedly closer to her paramour. Despite his initial desire for retribution against the man who had come between them, Charles realized it would be futile. Harper's life after their marriage seemed far from the disaster he had hoped it might be. Over time, he stopped dwelling on the matter. Instead, he resolved to move forward, putting this bitter chapter firmly behind him. Cheating Secrets podcasts like me.